The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. Because these are the 19 alleged hijackers, but 15 of them lived in Florida, where many of them had been issued duplicate licenses. Others had passports had been stolen, which meant that somebody was using their identity for them and leaving behind a trail in their name. And we now know from the BBC News shortly after 9/11 that I think 7 of them were alive and well after 9/11. And they said, my picture's being used, my name's being used, but I'm fine. I'm alive. So that raises the question. If at least 7 of the hijackers were still alive after 9/11, who were the people playing the roles of the real hijackers? Were there real hijackings? Was it all a show? Well, about the 19 hijackers, Robert Mueller, who was then head of the CIA, FBI, excuse me, said in September 2002, he said, there is no legal proof to prove the identities of the suicidal hijackers. The whole name of the game of the terrorism is to scare us into supporting Israel's aims, to drive us as a nation, as a people, as a military, right behind the Israel camp, so that we become the fighters of their wars for them because we are affected by the fear. In 1978, Israeli intelligence agent Arnon Milchan made his first film called The Medusa Touch, in which a Boeing 747 crashes into the Pan Am building. Here they are setting up for the film. This is the cover of the book. And here we have, the same year he made the film, here we have Arnon Milchan meeting with Israeli Defense Minister Ezer Weizman. So you can see he's at the very highest level of the Israeli military. They're making a movie predicting something that's going to happen in the future. Here he is. He's a big Hollywood producer, made JFK, Pretty Woman, Brazil, other films. He's said to be worth $5 billion, but the point is, if you read the book about Arnon Milchan, called Confidential, you'll see that he is the external banker who controls the slush funds that Mossad uses for external operations. That's where the money comes from. And he made this film in the year 2000. Well, his business partner, a man named Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News, Rupert Murdoch's company made this film in 2000, in which a Boeing passenger aircraft is flown into the World Trade Center. And in this movie, the plane is remotely hijacked with passengers on it. And the blame is put on the American military-industrial complex, looking for a new enemy. In 1979, this is 1 year later, the head of Israeli intelligence, this man, Issa Harel, predicted that the Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York City. And in 1979, this man, Bibi Netanyahu, came back from he had been working in Boston for a Rothschild company called Boston Consulting Group in Boston. He went back, this is his father, and they started something called the Netanyahu Institute, in which they began promoting the idea of terrorism being the scourge that the West has to fight. Mr. Netanyahu went on to make a career promoting the war on terrorism, how the West can win, fighting terrorism, and calling for the United States to come to the Middle East to wage war against those terrorist entities that were plaguing Israel. Because the Netanyahu logic goes like this. He says that Israel is attacked because the Arabs are opposed to our Western identity, our Western values, our Western way of life. We're a Western nation, he says. And therefore, the West is the target. Therefore, it's incumbent on the West to come and fight the terrorists for us, because we're all the target. So what they did in 1983, in order to have a war on terror, you need to have a foe. So they created the foe. They created the foe in Pakistan using a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was a very anti-Western militia group. He had it called Hezb Islami. And the CIA and the Saudis bankrolled the operation, and the Israelis trained and armed these people in Pakistan. It was done in 1983, in 85 it began, when this man, Ehud Barak, was the head of Israeli military intelligence. And they sent their men and weapons they had taken off the battlefield of Lebanon, took them to Pakistan, and trained these characters, people like Osama bin Laden, in the arts of terrorism. And in 1983, it was done with Charlie Wilson, this congressman from Texas. He's the one who led the whole thing. And he arranged with the Israelis to provide the weapons and the trainers in Pakistan. And this is him shaking hands with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But the question is, why would the United States and Britain, Why would they be funding and training the most anti-Western of the Mujahideen? This man was rabidly anti-Western. Why would you do that? Because they were creating the boogeyman. They were creating the enemy for the next war on terror, which was Al-Qaeda. And it was done, this is the man, this is Zvi Rafia, the head of Israeli intelligence in Washington, D.C., and he was this man's handler, Charlie Wilson's handler. And this man, Zvi Rafia, used Charlie Wilson's office as if it were his own office. And this is the Hebrew-speaking double agent named Ali Mohammed, who was Osama bin Laden's first trainer. Now, he's supposedly Egyptian, but he speaks fluent Hebrew. Where did he learn the Hebrew? He's a double agent. So he was working with the Israelis, training Osama bin Laden, and creating this. And this guy, he set up the cell that bombed the U.S. embassies in Africa. He trained the men who were blamed for bombing the World Trade Center in 1993. And he trained the men who killed Rabbi Kahana in New York City. And then he was finally arrested and put in jail for bombing the embassies in Africa. He was put in a federal penitentiary in this country, from which he disappeared without a trace. And this is the Gulbuddin's gang. This is when they became Al-Qaeda in 1994. The Arabs became Al-Qaeda, and the Pashtun speakers became Taliban. Then Israeli Mossad got the contract for the World Trade Center in 1987, a security contract, anti-terrorism security contract. And it went to this man, Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor. He was the head of Shin Bet. He was involved in a murder in Palestine, in Israel, of a couple Palestinians, and he came to America and was the president of this company, Atwell Security, who got the contract for the World Trade Center. But when the Port Authority discovered, this is Zvi Malkin and Shalom Ben-Dor, when the Port Authority discovered that this man was using a fake name and he'd been convicted of murder in Israel, they tore up the contract. Had they not torn up the contract in 1987, 9/11 probably would have happened in the 1980s or early 1990s. But they were rejected by the Port Authority. They didn't go home to Israel. They didn't give up the plan. They went to work for a couple American Jews who did have inside in the Pentagon, Maurice Greenberg and Jules Kroll. And Jules Kroll had a company called Kroll Associates who got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1993 after the first bombing. And at that point, Shalom Ben-Dor was working for him. And in 1992, this son of a terrorist, this is Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago right now. His father was a member of that Stern gang, the Leahy gang. This man became the senior advisor to Bill Clinton. This is the guy that set up the whole Lewinsky thing, but he was also instrumental. He was the Mossad's man in the White House, so that he made sure that the right people got appointed to the bench, the right appointments were made under Clinton to make the 9/11 project move forward. And then this ideation of the war on terror, or of the 9/11, came out in this article in Foreign Affairs, in which Philip Zelikow, John Deutsch, and Ashton Carter wrote about catastrophic terrorism, how this would be something that could happen next month. And in this article, they had a study group. They imagined the transforming event. They imagined the event like 9/11 that would change America fundamentally, change our policies, our foreign policy, our domestic policy, change the nation. This was printed in Christmas 1998. Two of the authors, Ashton Carter and John Deutsch, worked for a company called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. I point out these Rothschild connections because there are, throughout the entire saga, you find that one step removed from the crime, you find a Rothschild connection. And in 2001, an Israeli Mossad company, Rothschild company, called ICTS, controlled security at the US airports. They ran the company that either let these guys on the airplane or didn't. But their company was excused from the process, and so we'll never know unless we have some change in the attitude about 9/11. And then in July 2001, Zionists, that's strong supporters of Israel, got the lease for the World Trade Center. It became their property. And that was done through a man named Ron Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder. And in Israel, he works together with Major General Daniel Rothschild at Mossad University. He has a school there, and he runs the Institute for Policy and Strategy. This man was put in charge of privatizing New York property for Governor Pataki. He oversaw the privatization efforts of New York State, in which they decided to privatize the World Trade Center, because the World Trade Center was public property prior to 9/11. And then it went from the Port Authority, this man, Lou Eisenberg, he transferred after negotiations the property to this man, Larry Silverstein. But these men are connected through something called the UJA Federation of New York, which is a Zionist fundraising operation, where he's the national chairman and he is on the board of the planning board. And again, Larry Silverstein, the man who got the World Trade Center lease for 99 years, is this man here. He had weekly phone calls every Sunday afternoon with Benjamin Netanyahu. Then in July 24th, 2001, he got the keys to the front door of the World Trade Center. This is what was left 5 weeks later. This is about the put options. You may have heard about the put options in which people profited by knowing that the stocks of the airlines and insurance companies would tank on 9/11. And the 95% of these options were put by this man's former company. Now this man is Buzzy Krongard, and on 9/11 he was executive director of the CIA. But before he became executive director of the CIA, he was the director of Alex Brown, the company that placed the put options. And here's the relationship between Alvin Krongard and his wife, and his wife works directly with Rothschild Asset Management. And then there were thousands of Israelis who were warned about 9/11, and there were 4,000 who were expected to have been at the World Trade Center that day or the Pentagon. And that comes from the U.S. That comes from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. That's not Arab propaganda. It's from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And apparently they got the message through a system called Odigo, which warned people who had that Israeli system of messaging not to go to the World Trade Center that day. The message went out, the warning message went out about 2 or 3 hours before it happened. It warned people not to be at the World Trade Center at 8:45 because all hell would break loose. So apparently of those 4,000 Israelis who avoided harm got the message, they got the memo. And then there were these 5 dancing Israelis who were seen celebrating and high-fiving the attack at the World Trade Center before the first plane struck. They were on the New Jersey side of the river, and they were photographing and high-fiving, and they were observed, and they were arrested on the afternoon of 9/11. It was written about in the New Jersey newspapers, but it was not reported in any other paper outside of New Jersey. The 2 men that did not appear, they're on a TV show, these 3 guys are on a TV show. They said, we're not Mossad. No, because the 2 Mossad guys are sitting in the audience. The Kurtzberg brothers were sitting in the audience because they could not go up on the stage and say, we're not Mossad. They are Mossad. And U.S. law enforcement knew it from the minute they arrested these guys that they're Mossad. And one of the guys, this is one of the minions, he said, our purpose was to document the event. Here's the head of the company behind these Foster Grants here, Dominic Suter. He fled the country on the 12th or the 13th, and when the FBI went to get him again, he was gone. And this is one of the trucks of their company. They had this truck that was reported by New York police, Urban Moving Systems. It wasn't a moving company at all. It was a front company. It was set up to facilitate the 9/11 attacks. And they had this truck with the picture of the World Trade Center being struck by a plane. Now on 9/11, when it happened, in the studio, the London studio of the BBC World Television, the largest English-speaking broadcasting in the world, who was there except Ehud Barak, ready to give the interpretation. Remember, the General Wesley Clark said we did not have American understanding of it. No, what he's implying is that we had a foreign country's understanding of it. We had Israeli understanding. The Israelis interpreted 9/11 for us. This man, the head of, former defense minister, chief of staff, he said the world will never be the same from today on. We know who's behind this, Osama bin Laden, and we know where he is. He said it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. Full stop. And that's what we've been doing for the last 17 years, following the Israeli diktat, living our lives according to the Israeli interpretation of 9/11. That's what they've imposed on us. They've imposed a Zionist narrative to explain what happened on 9/11.
What we need to stand up and say is not only did they attack the USS Liberty, they did 9/11. They did it. I have had long conversations over the past 2 weeks with contacts at the Army War College, at Headquarters Marine Corps, and I've made it absolutely clear in both cases that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation, period. First, the disbelief, and what I show them immediately afterwards is an interview with a demolitions expert named Danny Jawenko, and it shows the third building at the World Trade Center going down. And they look at that, and I said, now you understand that if one of the buildings was wired for demolition, all of them were wired for demolition. And that's it. That's the tipping point. Getting into arguments about who was flying what and where they were and whether there was nanothermite, those things are true, but they're incidental. The thing that's necessary is to tell people 3 buildings went down, the third was not hit by a plane, it was wired for controlled demolition, therefore all of them were wired for controlled demolition, and at that point the reaction is rage. First disbelief and then rage. 9/11 has led directly to 60,000 Americans dead and wounded. God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people in other countries that we've killed or wounded or made homeless. This is an open wound. And what Americans need to understand is they did it. They did it. And if they do understand that, Israel's going to disappear. Israel will flat-ass disappear from this earth. I sent a film to one of my colleagues, and it basically had Americans grieving over their dead coming back. And I showed one of them. It was a woman just wrenched by grief, over her dead soldier. And I said, if Americans ever know that Israel did this, they're going to scrub them off the earth. And they're not going to give a rat's ass what the cost is. They are not going to care. The first thing, Mark, is astonishment. They didn't know. They truly didn't know. And these are not unintelligent people. They really didn't know. And the next statement is rage. Real rage. The Zionists are playing this as truly an all-or-nothing exercise. Because if they lose this one, if the American people ever realize what happened, they're done. The military has not been bought. The military is loyal, but it has not been bought. And if it ever understands this, really, really deeply understands this, and this is what I got when I put some of these things to the Army War College and to Headquarters Marine Corps. I mentioned to a contact at Headquarters Marine Corps, I said, they did 9/11. And it was, you don't mean it. I said, absolutely. And if they ever understand that, these people are history.
Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of
who else
terror.
Can you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's responsible. Every simple step, crossing borders or going on a plane or on a ship, will become more complicated. It's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society. This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror consistently along 6 or 10 years. Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order, no world order possible.